The title of my paper is Absolute and Relative Perfection of the Monsters. And that's the reason why I think the position, the place of my paper here, my presentation here, after the one of Annie Ibrahim is particularly appropriate, because the topics of let's say the dichotomy or distinction between absolute and relative identity and difference is central in my paper. But also for another reason. Diderot said Annie is not considered as a philosopher in France. It's not so in Italy. And I wonder if Giacomo Leopardi today is considered as a philosopher outside of Italy, because for a long time he was only a poet, and only last year his enormous Zibaldone di Pensieri was translated into English in 2013. And there is already a quite rich tradition of interpretations of Leopardi as philosopher in Italy, but it's not the case, the same case, for example, in the United States or in England. Well, my attempt is to try to present Leopardi as a philosopher. And the philosophical personality of Giacomo Leopardi is still little known outside Italy. He was presented primarily as a poet to the general public for a long time, but his career as a classical philologist, he was also a classical philologist, and as a linguist and literary scholar, was only studied in smaller circles. On the other hand, the extensive chapter of a Leopardi philosopher has always remained a little blurred. If the Operette Morali, it's the title of the work of Leopardi, if the Operette Morali were translated into English already in 1882, and then again twice in the 80s of the 20th century, the author's immense, let's say, scratch pad, we are speaking of 4,526 manuscript pages entitled Zibaldone di Pensieri. This is the title that Leopardi himself gives to this manuscript in 1827 when he tries to prepare an index, a complete index of this manuscript. I was saying, this immense scratch pad, the Zibaldone di Pensieri. Zibaldone is a word very difficult to translate. Zibaldone, let's say, can be translated with mixture or commonplace book. It's also a possible translation. As a matter of fact, in this translation, which appeared last year, the title is in English is Zibaldone, and then Zibaldone, the notebooks of Leopardi as title. Well, this immense manuscript, Zibaldone di Pensieri, was partially translated for the first time into English in 1992 and in full only last year. Reading the Zibaldone reveals not only Leopardi's amazing breadth of culture, the dizzying depths of his theoretical elaborations, such as for example, theory of pleasure, which Leopardi develops and is articulated over several years, the systematic thoroughness of his linguistic and philological notes, and the overflowing accumulation of moral notes in the manner of Montaigne or Pascal. The Zibaldone is also a constantly up-and-running laboratory in which ideas are forged, which Leopardi then pours from time to time into his prose and poetry. There is a structural functionality of the Zibaldone not only for the 111 pensieri, thoughts, published posthumously in 1845, which are literally extracted from the Zibaldone, but also and above all for the Operette Morali, which Leopardi composed according to a precise plan between January and November 18 24, and that the Zibaldone follows step by step. Thus, reading the Zibaldone not only helps us to discover a richer and more varied Leopardi than the one that transpires from his literary work, but, and this is what really matters, it enables us to understand to what extent all Leopardi's work is substantiated by philosophy and thought. This is clear in the case of the operette, which transfer, or better translate, the entire political, cultural, and philosophical motivations, thoughts and intentions processed in the Zibaldone into an apparently literary work. Moreover, it is the same Leopardi when writing to the publisher of the operette, Giacomo Fortunato Stella, on December 1823, in response to the intention of publishing them in separate issues, who objects, I quote, "To be published in part of 108 pages each supremely harms a work that wishes to be judged on the whole and by its systematic entirety, as is the case in all philosophical things, though written with apparent lightness." End of quotation. There is therefore a system, which is a system that is not external, not literary. The apparent lightness of the prose is a strategy adopted by Leopardi to strike at the imagination and the sensitivity of the readers, and through these to spread new ideas that at this point, the first edition of the operette was published in 1827, are still those criticizing a modernity understood both in the sense of a Christian bourgeois overall cultural and religious horizon, which depresses the energetic republican virtue and highlights weakness and tyranny, according to the lesson learned from Machiavelli, and that Leopardi criticizes in the name of sensistic and materialist conception of the world, and more specifically in the sense of a restoration world in which all achievements by revolutionary Jacobin France and Enlightenment thought are strongly contrasted by the aristocratic bourgeois bloc. The Operette Morali were published for the first time in 1827. This book found no admirer. It was considered, even by the progressive intellectuals closest to Leopardi, as the testimony of a misanthrope, an incurable pessimist. This also helps to explain the growing isolation in which Leopardi felt himself to be, and that eventually he even tried to look for, and that is the final turning point of his thought towards a form of desperate and anarchic nihilism. This transition from a form of ethical political commitment fueled by democratic ideals to the later desperate nihilism can be considered from multiple perspectives. And in this respect, the Zibaldone proves invaluable, because it records faithfully, almost directly, the temporal unfolding of its author's thoughts. So, if you take the entry, I quote, "the nature of men and things," and the entry, "civilization, domestication," both present in the catalogue prepared by Leopardi for the Zibaldone indexes in 1827, one can see how these changes occur, and how around and in parallel to these two fields, others are formed, which record the particular inflections that the theory takes on over time. We therefore have from the beginning, the first notes in the Zibaldone are dated 1817. So we find in the Zibaldone from the beginning entries, and I continue quoting from the catalogue and from the index prepared by Leopardi, entries such as theory of pleasure, or sensitivity feelings, or illusions, or monarchy and republic, or human perfection or perfectibility, or corruption and decadence of man occasioned by knowledge, or Christianity, or Machiavellianism of society. Then, from 1820-21, new entries may be found, such as truth or habituation. This is a very crucial notion in Leopardi's thought. In Italian is assuefazione. I don't know if it's good. It's a good translation. Habituation, and then desire, vitality, sensitivity, the degree of self-esteem and unhappiness of living is proportional to them, and then despair, and finally, roughly from middle 1824, more entries are added, such as happiness cannot and does not exist in the universe, or the garden, miserable spectacle of a garden that under joyful appearance is a true hospital. And then living beings essentially souffrant and unhappy, or everything is evil. Even just the simple list of categories with the brief explanations that Leopardi sometimes gives makes the transformation of his thought clear from a vitalistic conception of nature, in which nature is the positive but irretrievably lost model, to a vision of a world focused on an entirely negative concept of nature, which is likened to an impersonal machine indifferent to the fate of the living, and against which protesting is a right, even though this protest is devoid of any practical significance. It has been said that the operette morali were written between January and November 1824. The composition of the Dialogo della natura di un islandese, dialogue between the nature and an Islander, dates precisely, this is one of the operette, dates precisely from 21st to 13th May, and for the first time sets forth this conception in a complete way, where nature is depicted with the image, I quote, of a woman of boundless form, not fictional but alive, a face halfway between beautiful and terrible. A few days later, on June the 2nd, 1824, there is an entry which in the catalogue of 1827 opens the column, I quote, obvious and horrible contradictions and monstrosities in the system of nature and existence. In this notation, Leopardi begins by referring to the operetta just written. He writes, "The horrible mystery of things and of universal existence, see my Dialogo della natura di un islandese, above all at the end," and so on. Its starting point is the observation of the essential, necessary, and unavoidable simultaneous desire for happiness and state of misery in all living beings. If every living thing tends to happiness, but happiness, however, is impossible, then life in general is suffering from something that is its direct negation. In this way, though, Leopardi adds in the same text, we would have a world of beings doomed to be imperfect by necessity, that is, with no real and individual existence. Thus, life would never be perfect. But this is a contradiction, since evil, writes Leopardi, cannot be a positive principle of existence, but only its limitation. Therefore, I quote, "Being unhappy is not being bad, and here bad should be understood not in a moral sense, but in an ontological one, as an incomplete ratio essendi. And consequently, I quote, unhappiness will not be neither a contrary nor hostile evil to those who suffer of it. On the contrary, it will do good, because everything that is contained in the essence and nature of an entity must be good for that entity." End of quotation. The conclusion is therefore as follows. Every existence as such is perfect, in the sense that it exists fully and not as faulty, in comparison with other forms of existence. But this existence is unhappy. That is, it necessarily lacks its fulfillment, its form or telos in the Aristotelian sense. As a result, there is a perfection, a good of beings, which is intimately divided, however, on the verge of contradiction, a kind of imperfect perfection. The good of every living being is in this single living being, but it cannot help but feel it as external to himself, as elusive, and finally as non-existent. It is at this point that Leopardi, in the text of the Zibaldone that I quoted, puts the question, who can understand this monstrosity? At this point, we are in June 1824, Monstrosity therefore means the paradox of existence. This paradox consists in the fact that every living being as such has a kind of emptiness inside, a void that at the same time and paradoxically makes its absolute perfection something lacking, which pushes the living to seek that happiness that it cannot not desire and cannot find in itself, indefinitely outside himself. As we have seen, Leopardi considers every living being as perfect. He had reached this conclusion a few years earlier, in 1821, whilst reflecting on the notion of possibility. This is in fact defined as that which remains of the raison d'être or foundation of things once any relationship between contingent things and necessary universal principle has been eliminated. If, I quote, nothing exists prior to things and everything is posterior to existence, as stated in a note written in September 1821, there will be no parameters left on which to discriminate absolute from relative, the necessary from the contingent. The place traditionally occupied by God would therefore be occupied by a generic possibility, such as being in all ways possible, therefore also not being. Once having excluded the identification between necessity and God as ens realissimum, the concept of foundation is no longer a guarantee of existence, but only a guarantee of its possibility, including therein its non-existence. Necessity thus mixes with contingency. Consequently, the absolute is not deleted. Deleting it would mean becoming its orphans, missing it, but dissolved and translated into its infinite manifestations, all absolute and perfect in their own way. Leopardi writes in September 1821, I quote, "One can say, but it is a question of names, that my system does not destroy the absolute, but multiplies it. It destroys the abstract and antecedent idea of good and evil, truth and falsehood, of perfect and imperfect, independent of all that is. But it makes all possible beings absolutely perfect, that is perfect per se, having the reason of their perfection in themselves. And in this, that they are so, and that they are made so. A perfection that is independent from any extrinsic reason or necessity and any pre-existence. Therefore," I'm quoting, "all relative perfections become absolute, and the absolutes multiply instead of vanishing, so as to be both different and opposite to each other." End of quotation. This idea of many absolutes, even opposite to each other, rehabilitates the idea of opposition and that of plurality. They will no longer be synonymous with imperfection and contingency, the plurality, or absurdity and deprivation, the opposition. Plurality and opposition will be the characteristic features of each thing, which enjoys absolute perfection. As could be said with Spinoza, it is a determined expression of the substance. Between 1821 and 24, Leopardi introduces the link between absolute and contingent directly into the structure of the absolute. The monstrous feature of the contradiction of existence is therefore not only a manifestation of an existential protest. This is an aspect that will prevail later, but at least until 26-27, the dominant meaning of monstrous is another. It is the coexistence of perfection and imperfection, necessity and contingency within the structure of existence. The idea of this coexistence, as we have seen by reading the fragments from September 1821, stems from the attempt to think of reality as a structure in which essence follows and does not precede existence. Potentia follows and does not precede the actus, and the self-same judgment criteria are historical issues. Reading the Zibaldone text of the period 1820-22, one sees that Leopardi absorbs multiple cultural sources which are functional to this project. The ancient and modern skepticism, the Minor-Socratic and sophistry school, the Rousseau conception, and before that of Montaigne, of history as the acquisition of habits which become nature, the anti-innatistic gnoseology of Lockean matrix, with its offshoots in the ideologie, and the sensism of Montesquieu. Leopardi reads the Essai sur le goût in early July 1820, the radical immanence of D'Holbach. This system of sources, documented by readings conducted throughout these years, helps to explain the direction in which Leopardi moves. But this is only partly true, however, because the conclusion he reaches is in any case original, that the question of absolute necessity and truth should not be skeptically eliminated, but should be reformulated in new terms. And it is actually these new terms which delimit the field of the monstrous. The concept that makes the reformulation of absolute necessity and truth in new and original terms is the concept of habituation, which recalls the classic idea of habitus as second nature, but puts it in an entirely new anthropological perspective, which greatly expands its meaning. To understand what this perspective is, one can start from a brief aside contained in Leopardi's letter to André Jacobsen in June 1823. Leopardi writes, Je n'ai fait aucune différence de la sensibilité à ce qu'on appelle vertu. As may be seen, Leopardi knowingly assigns a different meaning from the traditional current meanings, ce qu'on appelle, to the term virtue. And this diversity resides precisely in the identity of virtue and sensibility. In the above-mentioned Zibaldone index, when talking of sensitivity, Leopardi refers respectively to, on the one side, sensitivity, feeling, and to vitality, strength of the body, sensitivity, whether they lead to happiness. Therefore, sensitivity is nothing other than vital power. And virtue is an expansion of this power, which, be it noted, is not the opposite of self-regard, that is of the desire for happiness, but its direct manifestation. As stated in a note of March-April 1821, as Leopardi writes, self-regard can take on very different aspects, as it is the only engine of animal actions. That which is now selfishness was once heroism, and from it come all virtues, no less than all vices. End of quotation. Shortly beforehand, in 1820, Leopardi had planned to write a work in which his, I quote, need to render virtue an amiable thing, not by reason, but by passion and usefulness, could be demonstrated. As can be seen, the moral sphere directly expresses the mechanical contrast of passions, in the sense that the system of norms, rules, and even the categories that are used to discriminate and judge are an articulation of the passions and their conflicting dynamics. The name that this articulation from life to ideas takes on is thus habituation. Thanks to habituation, the critique of universalism and innatism is radicalized and is converted into a general view of soul-body relationships, in which there is no longer any preordinated place for cognitive faculties, but knowledge is pragmatically organized and disorganized within itself through its own processing. Actually, one cannot therefore talk of faculty anymore, because, as stated in a memo dated 22nd July 1821, I quote, not only all faculties of man are a faculty for habituation, but the same habituation faculty depends on habituation. According to Leopardi, the body-soul continuum presents a basic plasticity which receives the life forms that the different civilizations claim to promote, and which in turn actively feeds them in a self-constituting manner. When he speaks of civilization, Leopardi always bears the opposition between the ancients and the moderns in mind, an opposition present since Machiavelli and made classic in the 18th century, which is thought of as, I quote, two different and distinct species of civilization, both really complete in themselves. That is, as a form of habituation or as alternative and competing forms of habituation, democratic, expansive, and heroic the first, despotic, depressive, and founded on humility and weakness the later. The completeness of both forms highlights the fact that habituation always fills the entire anthropological available space. It leaves nothing outside itself, nothing indefinite or uncertain. But at the same time, as each habituation is a contingent articulation, the possibility of a different arrangement of the link passion's reason always remains open. It is necessary to keep in mind this double level on which habituation works. On the one hand, it crosses passions and moral habits so that acquiring a moral habitus has nothing to do with reason, with the adjustment to a universal of the practical reason. On the other, habituation consists in the imposition of a moral habitus on passions. It follows that the process of acquisition of moral habitus, and therefore the production of both a moral and a theoretical universality, is not denied, but unfolds inside the body, inside sensitivity, because it is a habituation of the body and not the sublimation of particular passions in a universal reason. This means that articulating passions in universal forms is a process of disciplining which renders them functional to the project of a specific civilization. At this point, it will be understood that when Leopardi speaks of perfection, imperfection, or being, existence, he doesn't mean these alternatives in general, but as historical outcomes of the process of habituation. That is, as the articulation and disciplining of passions. The ontological dimension of his thought depends on politics, in the sense that the dichotomy existing between ontological and existential dimensions acquires its meaning in the structure of civilization, in the kind of habituation, and in the self-same dimension of habituation in general. Therefore, when Leopardi speaks of perfection of each singular thing, whether a living being or an entire civilization, he does not mean it as a metaphysical ratio essendi, as if he wanted to replace the concept of God as a perfect being with that of multiplicity of perfect beings, in a certain sense democratizing the ontotheology. What he does is to totally change the problem. Perfection is not nothing but the very existence, but this in turn is not an inexplicable datum, but the product of a history of successive habituations. In a note of September 21, Leopardi writes, "Its," is speaking of each entity, "its way of being is perfect perché gli esiste così, because it thus exists." That is to say, the thus of the thing's existence is the reason for its perfection. That is, it is perfect because it is determined, shaped in a precise manner, made functional to a paradigm of civilization. The relationship between abstract and concrete is reformulated, not simply overturned, as will happen a few years later with Feuerbach, but placed placed on the floor of history, interpreted as a succession of habituations fighting and competing with each other. Before this succession, there is only nature in itself, which, however, given the existence of humanity, no longer exists as such. As may be read in a marginal annotation written on the same day of September the 2nd, 1821, I quote, "Everything is uncertain and lacking in rule and model, since we turn away from that of nature, the only form and reason to be." However, if this model provides the rule, what humanity meets along the way are only deviations. The natural rule, the only true absolute, will be present only because absent, as an elusive paradigm. In a certain sense, nature in its purity, as an absent rule, makes all exceptions absolute because it prevents any exception being converted into a rule. The figure of the monster, which, as we have seen, means a concurrence of perfection and imperfection, sums up this complex set of meanings that converge in defining civilization as a movement that conflictingly builds itself through the continuous production of second natures, that is, body protocols that are presented as absolute and universal rules. If civilization is a succession of second natures, and therefore is a constant deviation from a rule which is present only by its absence or inability, two distinct interpretations of the monster as a synthesis of this exception without rule are possible. The monster is first of all humanity itself, as it moves away from nature. Losing contact with nature, civilization moves away from the possibility of following a rule, and the subsequent habituations are monstrous precisely because they are less and less natural. The monster, in this case, signals an error, a lack. This idea appears in a memo dated July 1823, which identifies the growth of civilization with the qualitative and quantitative growth of, I quote, "imperfect, faulty persons with monstrous bodies, including those that are not to be born and are lost because of abortions, deformities, etc., neither voluntary nor provoked." This idea is not new. It was present in general, even in ancient times, in the topos of structural unhappiness of human beings due to separation from the static equilibria governing nature. The theme is found, for example, in Pliny's Naturalis Historia, and returns exactly the same in Leopardi's Canto Notturno di un pastore errante dell'Asia. Pliny, moreover, is one of the Leopardi's sources. The fact that this is a traditional topos helps to understand its presence in the Zibaldone, but also its relative strangeness to the main direction of Leopardi's thought. In fact, this idea of monstrosity is contrary both to the absolute perfection of all things and to the idea, which is well defined in Leopardi, of a homogeneity between human civilization and the animal world. In fact, in a note taken exactly 1 year before, on July 23, after stating that the human race, compared with animals, presents a vastly greater amount of differences, including, I quote, monsters defective from birth or after birth, which are infinite among men, Leopardi then adds, "This thought, after careful consideration, I found is not true, however I leave it in the way." In fact, he adds, in the same text, the difference in physical proportions between individuals seems greater than in other things, only because we are used to this discernment within the human race as it is more familiar to us, whereas as soon as we move away from this extreme familiarity, for example by judging populations never seen before, they all look the same, In reality, the diversity among animals is just as great as among men. But in this way, the very idea of monster as a deviation from a rule crashes, because this rule, in fact, does not exist. And the notion of monster can be generalized to encompass any difference. Life is a difference, or rather, the production of difference through habituation against a background that always remains the same. The form of habituation are inseparable from life in all its manifestations, and what varies is our ability to understand the way in which it is exercised. The monster is not therefore something horrible. Sure, it marks an exception, but as we, with our limited perspective, who assign a negative meaning to it. In a note dated September 1823, this relationship is developed very clearly by implicitly recalling the relationship that Lucretius establishes between fear and the birth of religion. I quote, "Those whom the ancients called monsters, that is, extraordinary things, albeit not terrible in themselves, materially were all estimated as bad omens. These are all signs that for a man it is easier and he is more prone to fear than to hope, especially in nature, in children, ignorant people, and natural men." End of quotation. That deformed beings should be terrible for themselves is ultimately also a result of prejudice arising from fear. As if identity, in order to sustain itself, needed to artificially create those barriers that in natura rerum cannot be uniquely identified anywhere. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this lecture. I have a little question about. It's really a question. I don't know if it is consistent, but what do you think of putting a relation between this idea of assuefazione and the idea of Gramsci, the dressage, the Americanismo e Fordismo? It's a kind of. You think that?
There is a difference. There is a difference because.
May I also ask a question about the same term, assuefazione, which has also a connotation as a passive process. I mean, in Italian, assuefazione is also linked to addiction, drug addiction, for instance, and it's like I just checked to see how they translate it. They translate it as habit forming. And in this sense, it means that the subject that undergoes the process of assuefazione is passive in respect to this process, which would mean that in respect to nature, any being, is completely terminated in this process. Is it like this? And maybe
okay. No, to the first question, no, there is a difference because in Gramsci, what is the source of the process of dressage is an idea, or we can say an ideal. There is a dimension in Gramsci thought that we can call practical reason. But sure, it is very different from any other version of this notion, but it is practical reason. That is, there is no sensism in Gramsci's thought, no? In Gramsci's philosophy of praxis, there is no sensism. Gramsci Leopardi's thought is partially translatable in Gramsci's thought or language if we think to the theory of the translation of languages. In this theory, that is to say, in the language, which in Gramsci's thought is something material that has to do with everyday life, no? With common sense and so on. Then in this dimension of Gramsci thought, you can find something like the Leopardi sensism, but it's not the same thing. But I think there is an analogy, maybe also. It could be also, it could even be something more than an analogy in Gramsci's notion of a personality as a composition of multiple tendencies. Gramsci has a molecular notion of personality, which stems from the French debate on molecular biology and on language and on pragmatism and on idealism, positive, and so on, of the late 19th century, but which has its sources probably in the 18th century, in that idea of personality that you illustrated before. Is habituation, assuefazione, only something which can be described as passive adaptation? No, because assuefazione, as I said, assuefazione works on two different levels. It's an imposition of a discipline, of a new rearticulation of passions on the one side, and on the other side, it doesn't make this work from outside the passions, no? And the main passion of human beings is the desire of happiness. So, assuefazione has to do with the desire of happiness. It cannot ignore this datum. So it is from this point, we can, if we think to this point, we can then distinguish between civilizations, because not every civilization makes the same thing with the desire of happiness. There is an enormous difference between the ancient and the modern civilization in this respect. It doesn't mean that they are not complete in themselves, no? But it means that they are that the modern civilization is more fragile than the ancient one, because it doesn't give to the life the space the life is requiring.
Actually, I believe I have 3 questions, and the first is a continuation of this point. So I agree entirely, Fabio, with what you say. There is a difference with Gramsci, and I like the way immediately in your response you said Gramsci's dressage or whatever is based on the ideal. And in fact, I would say it's ideological. It's based on ideology. And I think what you are talking about is a kind of habituation, or if you wish, normalization or something, which precisely because it passes through the passions and involves the body, I see more similarity even to something that one would call biopolitics already, which is precisely not based on ideology. It's not an ideological normalization. It's it involves the passions, and the body directly. So my question would be, first of all, these two. And in addition to that, and it corresponds, if we want to accept a distinction that Balibar has made very explicit between ideology and commodity fetishism. It's a mode of commodity fetishism where subjectivity and objectivity are constituted parallel. And I see this kind of model there as opposed to the ideological model of normalization. So that's my first question. I would like you to comment on that. The second is regarding the issue of perfectibility. I'm unclear. I thought initially that what you meant was that it's a matter of within each given civilization, a comparison between how perfect the individual, or rather how the state of perfection of the individual serves the civilization. So if it serves it at 100%, then it's perfect, if not, and so on. Or whether you mean this, or whether you mean it in a historical, teleological perspective that this civilization was, let's say, 80% perfect, or not the civilization, the perfect. And the next one was 85, so that's my second question, which of the two is the model. Then the third question is, how much do you see Leopardi's model it is very Spinozian in many ways. What are the differences, the major differences, if any? Well, I have a fourth one. And the fourth one is about the desire of happiness. Actually, you addressed that, as you said, every civilization has a totally different desire of happiness. Like, I don't know, the theocratic happiness is, I don't know, it's afterlife, it's in afterlife, it's not here. So that would be a major difference between the ancient and the modern, right? Okay.
No, to the fourth question, the main difference between ancient and modern is the fact that the ancient, they had not an ideology of truth. Mm-hmm. The ideology of truth, that is not the notion of truth, but the ideology of truth is born with Christianity. I am the true way, and so on. No? And Leopardi, for Leopardi, this is a radical turning point, because the ideology of truth, that is the idea, the idea that truth is something absolute, is born with Christianity, and is influent in the whole history of the Christian bourgeois. I'm speaking very roughly, but okay, Christian bourgeois civilization. Spinoza is one of the sources of Leopardi. It has been documented. It is a method that has been studied. I spoke about this with Vittorio before, and Leopardi knew Spinoza, and above all knew the whole Spinozist tradition after Spinoza. And Spinoza, I would say that a lot of things cannot be explained without Spinoza in Leopardi's thought. No, perfectibility. As a matter of fact, perfectibility is simply the fact that a word that says that human beings are can change. There is no teleology. No, there is no teleology. That is to say, for Leopardi, for example, in the moment when the enunciation of the ideology of truth is made, then this civilization is virtually already completed, already perfect in se. No? What this civilization then makes is, let's say, an articulation, more explicit articulation of what already is in this core. No, the first question, I don't know, the fetishism. No, I never thought to this. I know the distinction Balibar makes, and I would say that it is an interesting clue to think on. But in this moment, I
yeah, I have a short question. I also saw a lot of resonances with Spinoza in what you were describing. I'm wondering then how, can you say a little more about this move, if he was so influenced by Spinoza, into the sort of, I think you called it a depressive, anarchistic, like how does that happen, coming from that background?
What I presented today is Leopardi was born 1798 and he died 1837 at the age of 39. It was a very short life, and it can appear a little odd, distinguish in this short life different periods, but Leopardi was, as other geniuses in the history of mankind, like Mozart, for example, an enfant prodige, and he began to write and to publish at the age of 12, I think, and he wrote a mare magnum of works, published and unpublished. So what I presented today is the Leopardi between, let's say, the beginning of the Zibaldone, 1817, until the publication of the publication of the Operette Morali, the first edition, 1827. And what I think is that the same appearance of this work to this work to which Leopardi had committed a lot of hope in changing the public opinion in Italy. It is a political book, in my opinion. It was read exactly on the contrary, as an example of a pessimism without hope and so on. And from this year on, the last 10 years of Leopardi's life, Leopardi moved to a kind of pessimism without hope, and to a kind of anarchism in politics and nihilism in philosophy. I didn't present today the last year of Leopardi, but in these last years, if it is not exactly only this, no? But in these last years prevails this pessimism without perspectives. I think it is the cause is the political delusion he suffered.
Thank you.